I'll ask the first question. Because one of the themes that has emerged in the course of this presentation is the change to the culture, which appears to have come about as an increasing number of people have only the experience of fractured family life themselves to go on. And we've talked about, Bettina raised the question of the ABC shaping the culture, and in a sense promoting a broader acceptance of this change. Now, many clergy, and my ears did prick up at the word clergy, many clergy have absorbed their worldview from the ABC to quite an alarming extent, and I think do often really fear, quite genuinely, being perceived as being judgmental. I wonder, and this is a question to any one of you or all of you, in what ways would you like to see the churches challenge this broad acceptance of a changing culture?
I cannot remember the last time I heard a sermon on these issues. I really cannot remember ever in my time in Australia, which goes back to 1986, hearing a sermon on adultery, for example. And I think the church's first responsibility is to its own. I mean, people in the pews listen, nobody else may do, but at least the audience for a sermon are the people who are sitting there. And I think we need to rediscover our courage on these issues, to give leadership within churches. Jesus said that the church should be like a city set on a hill, like a lamp that cannot be hidden. And unless there is a healthy family life in the church, we have no example to set to anybody else.
Thank you.
I used to do advice column for Clio, and I remember vividly, I used to always say when I had pregnant girls writing in, I'd say, can you afford to raise this child? You know, look at the decisions that are facing you. And what editors saying, we don't talk about that anymore. You know.
I think it'll be a long time before we see churchmen talking about this issue, because any time they do, they'll have the revelations about child sexual abuse within their organisations thrown in their face. So that has limited the cultural space in which churches can operate. Furthermore, I don't think it's particularly useful to deal with it in a traditional religious framework, because it's too easy to then slough it off and say, oh, it's just a bunch of religious people pontificating about stuff, about complex situations about which they don't know very much. And I've feared that myself when, you tread into these waters, that, you've got to realise that the people make judgments at the time and they have complex family situations. However, the way to approach it, I think, is the way that I've tried to approach it, as a public health issue, as a matter of what are the risks, informing people about the risks, and ultimately saying, well, look, if you want to give your children the best chance in life, you need to think seriously about the kind of relationships you're going to enter into before you have children. And it's presenting people with the evidence and trying to inform them. And it's basically trying to change the culture away from the one that just says, oh, marriage doesn't matter. And we don't talk about it.
Thank you. Question?
So the issue of cause and effect is extremely complicated. There is, for example, evidence of a significant increase in alcoholism amongst women of childbearing age, aged 20 to 39. Now, that has direct impacts to the child protection statistics that we were talking about. But why is it that women of childbearing age are showing a greater propensity towards alcoholism? That might take you back into the family. So it's incredibly hard to talk about cause and effect. What we do know, it is absolutely solid from all these statistics, is what I was saying about the adverse effects of family conflict on children. That is beyond any doubt. And that is a very strong link, I think, to the issues of adolescent mental health that I was talking about, and some of the other problems that we are seeing in children. Early onset sexual activity is very strongly related to family structure. Girls in particular who did not grow up with fathers in their homes are much more likely to begin sexual activity at an earlier age than those in intact married couples, families. So correlation is not causation. It's difficult sometimes to draw these linkages, but overwhelmingly, I think, the evidence is of the beneficial effects of growing up in an intact married family, and that some of these other social problems are connected with the absence thereof.
I'll take the... you often hear that's always, as Bettina was saying, particularly in relation to single mothers, that's always the argument, well, let's provide more support services, let's provide more support services for these families. I think it's very it's impossible to outsource the raising of children to social work professionals. And I actually think that the social workers are part of the problem here, because they're the fiercest adherence to the non-judgmental idea, the idea that we can't point out the bleeding obvious, which is that the idea of a poorly educated teenage girl having a child and trying to raise a family is a really, really bad idea, and something we should be discouraging, not something we should be papering over and saying, well, we can't talk about it, or we need to be non-judgmental about it.
I always get letters from people working on the coalface, social workers, people working with family law, who are dealing with families and these issues, and they're always, the ones who agree with me always talk about how difficult it is for them to have discussions with their colleagues around these sorts of topics. But I also think the media is incredibly important in this whole raising consciousness about these issues, and particularly the ABC. I once had a conversation with Mark Scott about the whole question of bias and used this as an example. It's what the ABC won't talk about. And this is a perfect example of the fact that they are having an enormous impact by refusing to discuss this issue.
If I add just a brief anecdote, when For Kids' Sake was launched, it was a report on these issues. It was on the front page of the Herald, second page of the Australian, and similarly around the country. And I did a large number of radio and other interviews. The ABC were just so hostile. But when I spoke to the talkback radio people, the shock jocks, as we might say, there was an incredible level of understanding, and because it resonated with their experience out in the suburbs and communities of Australia. But ABC Canberra, Canberra's not just another city, it's a different planet.
Can I ask Jeremy, the baby bonus, do we have any numbers now that's come out of that period that say that this was helpful or unhelpful? Did it help people who are in poverty to ease the burden, or did it create the wrong sort of incentives, or what's it show?
I think that's a story that should probably be chased up. Anecdotally, this is all that we know, that the people who actually worked on the ground thought that this was an insane policy, because it did provide an incentive for, $5,000 for a young teenage girl out in Penrith is a lot of money. And I think this also ties into another issue which I was sort of talking about with one of my ex-colleagues, Andrew Baker, and when he was looking at what we pay in welfare, he was saying that even with when you add up all the parenting payment plus family benefits, all the other things, if you look at what a single mother gets in income from the government, compared to her peers, it may actually be a reasonable income. Maybe not enough to properly raise a child, but an amount that actually makes her, in a sense, better off, regardless of what the impact are on children. So it's a more complex problem than just talking about marriage. But the welfare system is somewhere where we also need to start to look. And there are moves in Britain to try and wind back some of not wind back with the benefits anyone, but encourage marriage by removing some of these financial disincentives to marriage that actually do exist in the welfare system.
Thank you. Question here. I can only see your feet, I'm afraid, because of the light.
Not that tall.
No, it's the light.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, just a couple of things. Firstly, you mentioned about the ABC. Not wanting to engage. So from a radio perspective, they don't do shock jock type conversation, so that doesn't shock me. And also the last time I checked, there are many other channels on TV than the ABC, and from my understanding, they're not even covering it like 7 and 9 and 10. So we should focus on all of them, not just on one. But what I'm interested in more is you say that there isn't any clear statistics. There's American statistics, but not Australian statistics. And what I'd like to question is the focus here is on the fractured families, or, divorce, this and that, out of wedlock and all of that. But what about marriages that last, and child abuse in those marriages? People are less likely in a lasting marriage, particularly if the woman doesn't want to escape that marriage, to talk about these things. So getting statistics like that would be rather difficult. Particularly, say, I grew up in the 70s, and a lot of I'm an only child, but a lot of my schoolmates were like one of 8, one of 10, one of 12 children. I haven't seen that as common these days.
The studies that show elevated rates of sexual abuse of particularly girls who don't grow up with their natural fathers are retrospective studies. So they're surveys that have gone back and asked people when they're adults, were you sexually abused as a child? Who sexually abused you? What were the family circumstances? So they are actually there is quite solid evidence. Of course, there are natural fathers who abuse their children. It's a terrible problem. I agree that the family circumstances and the circumstances that you talk about people wanting to preserve the marriage and not face up to the truth, of course that happens. However, the statistics, and I cite the American statistics that show that yes, there is an elevated rate of child sexual abuse depending on family forms. And I think it goes to what Patrick was saying, that there is what they call, it's an ugly phrase that they use in literature, but there's an incest taboo with natural fathers where there is a protective instinct that makes them less likely particularly to sexually abuse their children, whereas for non-related fathers, it doesn't exist, and that's what explains the higher rates.
Can I just say, with regard to the ABC, the reason I totally agree with you, a lot of the other channels aren't covering it, television channels, for instance, as well, but this is our publicly funded broadcaster, which has a far more significant impact in terms of discussion of social issues than any other form of the media, and it drives the agenda, and that's why it matters.
And the reason why the commercial stations don't want to cover it is because divorce, cohabiting, single parenthood is much more common these days, and they don't want to annoy a substantial portion of their audience. It makes commercial sense not to talk about things like this. Whereas the ABC shouldn't have those commercial imperatives.
I suppose it depends on the type of show you're talking about.
Of course it does. Of course it does.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, it was an excellent talk from three of you. Thank you very much. I'm a 50s baby with 4 kids and both parents, so I'm sharing your views 100%. But I think since the 70s, we've developed a society. I'm coming to the question. we've developed a welfare and docs society that encourages the fractured family. Why couldn't people like yourselves who are out there, why couldn't we say of the baby bonus that instead of paying cash, it was a tax deduction? That would change a lot. And it was double if the child was born into a family where it was living with both biological parents. I mean, we laugh, and when I suggest this at dinner parties, I'm a flat earther or wild reactionary, but we have all these policies that are encouraging the fractured society. Why don't we put in tax policies that encourage the sort of society that we think works better?
Well, that's what they're doing in America, isn't it?
Yeah. In the UK.
It's exactly what they're doing
in the UK.
UK.
I think, yes, that is one policy response, but you first need to have the discussion, and I guess that's where we're at the stage. We're at the bottom of the mountain in terms of raising the profile before we get to that level of policy detail. I'll say.
We were accused of being depressing, and I totally understand that comment. The room for optimism is that the deterioration in Australian society is as yet less serious than it is in many parts of the Western world. The situation in Britain is dire. I think it is probably beyond reversal. The situation in America is quite mixed. In the African American community, it is disastrous. In Australia, we are not yet at the brink of disaster, but on the other hand, we are not yet having the conversation they're having in Britain and Australia and America, and even Sweden. Sweden is beginning to talk very openly about these issues because we simply can't afford the welfare society we have built with the levels of increase in social problems that we're now seeing. So the link between the economy and the welfare system is one which ought to encourage politicians to think hard about opening this conversation up.
Thank you. We have one final question.
I would like to hear the panel's opinion on recent work, which the technical terms of selection hypothesis into marriage, you're probably familiar with it, that has concluded that by far the greatest proportion of variation in the child's outcomes are due to personal factors like honesty, willingness to honor commitment, rather than the institutional sanction of marriage.
It's an awfully complex question because people who marry tend, as opposed to living de facto relationships or accepting single parenthood from the start, tend to have more traditional values around those things. Yeah. I think that there's been a huge amount of research done on the selection effect issue. For example, it used to be said that people who lived together before marriage had higher rates of breakdown than those who did not, but that was a selection effect. I think we've worked that out. The most modern research on this is suggesting that once you control for all selection effects, the advantages that marriage brings are overwhelming. And that's controlling for socioeconomic status, for education, for all the things that I think you are focusing on. The answer still comes out that marriage is very much more stable. And that in itself brings benefits to kids. So I think that argument's dead now, but there are still academics who run it.
Well, thank you. I think it's been an enormously useful session. If we're thinking about the need to invest in good ideas, and by golly we need to, our stocks are rather depleted. If we think about the infrastructure, if you like, of ideas, the sort of foundations of conceptual foundations on which we're going to build good social policy, good public policy, then establishing, re-establishing perhaps, the importance of the family is vital and essential work, and I think we've gone a long way to doing that this evening. We've, from Patrick, I think he gave us a very good empirical basis for this, although I think a lot of us kind of knew it already in our hearts that the marriage was a good thing. I debated on Channel 7 Sunrise on Saturday morning the Woody Allen Mia Farrow story, and I thought there's a lesson for every man in that story, that if you can avoid getting married to your ex-girlfriend's adopted daughter, it's probably going to make your life a lot simpler. Not judging the right and wrong in that case. None of us, of course, know. But I think it's a parable, if you like, for how when you get these complex, modern, progressive family structures, the tensions within that family are there for all to see. And there's enough tension in family life as it is without adding more. So the empirical case that Patrick made for the family is something we all feel. But I think we have to make this empirical case. There are the Conservatives out there at the moment. Corey Bernardi's recent book makes some very good points. Kevin Andrews wrote a very, very good book on marriage a year or two back, which was a very solid book. But I think that in the public square we're going to have to make this argument using this empirical public policy data, rather than try and make the moral case, rather than trying to fight the moralists on the progressive left who simply won't bend. Bettina Arndt, I think we all of us who've occasionally gone out there and made some less than conventional arguments in the public square would feel what Bettina said. You do feel very much alone in this. And the absence of the church is something that's quite surprising. I'd like the church to be more judgmental, Peter. I really would. That's what we pay them for, I think. But we need courage, don't we, to get out there and make these arguments. Jeremy's paper, I commend it to you if you haven't read it, is a very, very good piece of work. And Jeremy starts, I think, building the public policy arguments we need to start making. But it seems to me, I think my takeaway from this evening is that you can't deal with this in isolation in one policy area. I think we've identified a number of areas tonight where we have to do a lot of work to encourage the sort of family structures that we think make for a good society. I'm very uncomfortable, for instance, about the idea of simply coming in and giving grants to people to go and have marriage counselling. That seems to me just replacing one form of nanny statism with another. But what we can do is get our policy settings right across a range of areas. Tax policy we've spoken about, welfare policy obviously a key one here, and particularly stark, I think we'd all recognise those figures for single mothers, and how, while we know that correlation is not causation, there's a massive jump from the early 70s when payments to single mothers came in. We've seen a doubling, as we saw there, in the rates of single mothers since then, and we suspect that is probably not unrelated. But beyond that, the school curriculum, very good points there. The school curriculum is up for debate at the moment, and I had the pleasure or the displeasure of reading the entire thing on a flight from Perth recently, and it is absent. Anything of this nature seems to be absent. There's a lot about gender-neutral judgments and sustainability, but nothing that I read with this common sense advice that we should be giving to all our children. The ABC, of course, you can't have a conversation about anything these days without the ABC's failings coming to the fore. But look, I think this isn't a lost cause. I think we can make these arguments in the public square if we're forceful enough, and if we think of a way into them which is not confronting, which doesn't seem like just a negative, conservative reaction, but is in fact a positive contribution to try and get a better society. And finally, one small take out there, I saw the Australian Bureau of Statistics needs to be brought into line, one thinks. Brian Pink, the head of the Bureau of Statistics, is about to leave, and they're about to appoint a new head of the Bureau of Statistics. Let's hope when they do this, they'll be looking for somebody who can pull the Bureau of Statistics back away from some of the sort of fashionable causes it's been chasing in its number crunching, and back to some of these core sets of data that we really need to make informed policy decisions. So I'd just like to thank again all our panellists for their very, very strong contributions tonight. Patrick Parkinson, Bettina Arndt and Jeremy Sammut, and perhaps you join with me in the traditional manner. Thank you very much.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that brings this evening's event to an end. My thanks go to our speakers, Bettina Arndt, Patrick Parkinson and Jeremy Sammut, and to Nick for his vote of thanks and personal professional exhortation, and to Macquarie Bank for allowing us to use this venue.